So welcome. One of the recommendations that emerged in response to the Dasgupta review is that the finance sector would benefit from the development of national, regional, ultimately, baselines, targets for nature, coupled with a finance gap assessment. And I'm delighted to be joined here today by two guests to discuss this recommendation in more detail and many other things. Chris Dodwell, Head of Policy and Advocacy at Impacts Asset Management, and Onno van der Heuvel, Global Head of UNDP's Biofin. So thank you both very much for joining me today. And Chris, maybe you can start us off and set the scene for us as to why the financial sector would benefit from some sort of baseline or target setting from countries.
Well, thanks, Helen. It's great to be with you. At Impacts, we've got more and more involved in the natural capital biodiversity debate over the last few months. The Dasgupta review, we think, is really influential, and things like the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosure. And it's made us think around, this idea of what's missing on the policy front. And I think the Dasgupta review contains within it some of the clues to that. So it talks a lot about how many of the processes that shape our world are silent and invisible. And I think that's precisely the problem that we've got around understanding both dependency on nature of individual industries and therefore investments, but also which are those that are really causing harm. And this has massive consequences. We end up with a real externality here that is not being priced into current market values. So I think you can address this in two separate ways, both ideally at a country and a sectoral level. So the first one I think we need to do is to make sure that the impacts of nature on business are more apparent and that those are understood. So we really create this understanding of what a failure to take action is. So in terms of sort of baselines, you kind of almost need to have a baseline scenario, roughly, something like the kind of the climate change one of what happens in a 4-degree world. And you can really start to see then which are the industries that are going to suffer. And then from a risk perspective, you've got an understanding of what you call the physical impact risk. So you can start to identify and both identify what value at risk is going to be, but also create a community and a constituency that are looking for more action. And then on the flip side of that, you need to understand what the causes of nature degradation and biodiversity loss are and put policies in place to avoid those. And actually then to start to sort of see, well, what are the alternatives to those? So I think at a global level, that means you might be setting some kind of actionable target. And a starting point for that could be what Business for Nature are suggesting, something like halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. Because as soon as you've got the idea of halting biodiversity loss, it naturally forces you to look at the drivers of that biodiversity loss. So those were really clearly identified in the 2019 Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. 5 key areas of loss: land use change, direct exploitation, climate change, pollution, and invasive species. And I think if we can start to think about, well, what are the baseline situations in each of those countries, and ideally some kind of metrics to allow us to track those, I think that's the starting point for us to take policy action.
And I think you and I have talked before about this need to sort of almost create this transition risk scenario. So effectively, like this 1.5 degree equivalent for nature by sort of setting these sort of baselines and targets. So how might this be put into practice by the international community and by national governments?
So yeah, I mentioned this idea around turning the kind of some of the targets that are currently in the Convention of Biodiversity, which are a little bit abstract, quite frankly, at the moment for investors. I spend a lot of my time at Impacts trying to explain to our investment teams what the EU biodiversity strategy is going to actually mean for companies. So we need to just get on beyond that, this ideas of preserving 30% of the planet by 2030. It's very hard for you to actually go, well, which sectors is that going to affect? But I think if we can crystallize it maybe into those 5 causes that I was talking about, and then thinking at a national level, well, what do we need to do in order to halt the bad action, and how are we going to not only preserve that kind of stage where we're no longer damaging. So that will mean changing our ways of production, thinking about things like, say, vertical farming, or better use of digital agricultural technology to make better use of the farmland we've currently got to reduce pressure on land use change, and thinking about that sector by sector. And ideally, I think what you need to have this vision of where we're transitioning to on a sectoral basis. So fisheries, farming, forestation, where are we going, where are we now, and where are we going to? And I think that's best done at a national level. So I think that's where the national policy perspective is really going to kick in.
Thanks, Chris. So, Onno, maybe we can come to you to sort of bring this to life. Biofin does some of this work already. So can you tell us a bit more about that?
Right. So just to explain what Biofin is doing, it's trying to fill 3 different gaps that exist in countries. First of all, it's helping countries to create national baseline data on how much a country spends on biodiversity, because countries find that they simply do not have this data. And the second data set that countries don't have is how much they need. So these are the first 2 baseline sets that Biofin is helping countries to develop. And we have what is called the Biofin workbook or Biofin methodology that runs you through a comprehensive process in doing that, looking not just at the public sector, but also at the private sector. And it goes a bit beyond that, looking as well at subsidies and incentives that have a negative impact. And this is actually at the core of the Biofin approach, looking to catalyze more biodiversity positive investments and also helping to address negative impacts. Because we know that if you look at the global picture, around $120 billion per year is spent on biodiversity positive investments, but around 500 billion, according to OECD, is spent on things that harm nature. So unless we tackle that one as well, we don't really have a good finance strategy. And then I'm coming to the third point, what Biofin is doing, is helping to develop a national level, we call it biodiversity finance plans, to look at the most promising financing mechanisms to scale up finance for biodiversity or reduce those negative impacts. And the third element we're adding is also improving effectiveness of the finance. If we're just spending our money sort of more randomly, we're not going to have a huge impact. So we're also helping governments to be very strategic, help develop national frameworks and results-based budgeting approaches. And so how does that translate to a country? I just want to give you the example of the Philippines. So when we did this analysis in the Philippines, we found that protected areas don't get a lot of funding. And the reason behind that was they were not registered in the national legislation. So we helped to fill this gap. We helped to change the law, and more than 90 protected areas were recorded now into the law that was changed 2 years ago. And then we worked with a parliament member to develop a budget proposal. And that was approved by the parliament 2 years ago. And so now they have a new budget allocation of $40 million for the protected area system that's going to be implemented over a number of years. But these finance plans, again, don't just look at the public sector, they look at the private sector as well. And so an example of a more private, almost civil society kind of activity is a crowdfunding campaign we did as well in the Philippines, where we looked during the pandemic last year, and we helped to raise more than $30,000 for a local community that suddenly lost its income. They didn't have any income from tourism anymore. So we helped to raise some money around the world. And now local rangers are still getting the income that they used to have because they actually continue the work that they were doing. So these are just some examples, and there are also others.
Yeah, that's great. And just to clarify, so how many countries have you worked in so far?
We are working now in up to 40 countries. So we started with 12 and it grew rapidly. And just this year, we are welcoming 5 more countries, actually China, Argentina, Egypt, Uzbekistan, and Gabon are the latest ones joining. And they are largely developing countries, but some of them are, let's say, upper middle income or high income, like for example, Chile, the Seychelles, Costa Rica, we have Kazakhstan, Mexico. We're really working all around the world on financial issues, but of course, primarily focusing on developing countries.
And do you have any examples of how your work has helped countries attract sort of institutional investors or private finance? Anything you can share with us there?
Right. So the approach we have is that we support the ideas that are homegrown, coming from the countries themselves. So it really depends on which ideas are being put forward. But we do have quite a few of those. For example, in Mexico, we help to develop an accelerator fund. It means that we have all kinds of small organizations. They want to attract investments, but they're kind of too small and they don't know how to create bankable projects. So this is a kind of support mechanism for them. And also to sort of bundle these projects and have a kind of central dialogue with investors. We also work in Sri Lanka with the finance sector. We're working actually with the central bank in a kind of group on a national sustainable finance strategy, but that also includes commercial banks. So they developed this national strategy, and every financial institute has their own action points under this strategy. So it's a kind of comprehensive roadmap where the central bank and other finance institutes are each following up. And then we also work in, for example, Zambia on a green bond framework that was adopted last year by the government. And under this new framework, public and private entities can now for the first time issue green bonds.
Incredible. Now, obviously, you mentioned that you were working in developing countries. Are you seeing more interest from developed countries? And presumably, it'd be very helpful if every country made the same assessment so we could sort of form an accurate picture of what we might need globally.
Right. We see that the interest in this approach is rising. In fact, Ireland became the first Western European country to apply the Biofin methodology. We also recently found out that the Netherlands is doing the private sector expenditure review. I have to add that this one is more hard. Actually, the public sector data is just much more accessible, and companies are simply do not yet record their dependencies and impacts and risk related to nature. And we hope that this will change because of initiatives like the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures. But as well, actually, the Convention on Biological Diversity is discussing a target now to develop this kind of biodiversity finance plan in every country. And that's on the agenda for this year, for the COP in this October. And if that's adopted, it means that every country will develop this kind of finance plan, including those baseline assessments. So it means that this could be really scaled up. And once all countries start to do that, we have a much clearer picture of also the global situation. Because when we did this analysis, we had to develop a model on the global level of biodiversity expenditure. We had this developing country data quite accurately, but the developed country data was much less available. And so if countries start to do these expenditure assessments more in developed countries, then that situation will change in the future.
Yeah. And coming back to you, Chris, you know, you're engaged in COP15 and some of those plans there. What are your hopes for COP15 from a financial sector perspective?
At Impacts, what we really do is we are looking to identify solutions that we can kind of invest in. All of our funds are invested in the transition to a sustainable economy. So there are 3 levels at which I'm really hoping to see action this year, and I'm pretty confident that things are going to take place. So the first one is within the negotiations themselves. I worked on the climate negotiations for many years, and I know how important that is. So I think what we're looking for is we're looking for that clear direction of travel to come out from the negotiations and the kind of messages that are going to make a difference to investors. I'm really pleased that the CBD Secretariat is now undertaking these outreach to the financial sector and to business. And there's a forthcoming workshop where hopefully that'll help to steer the direction of those negotiations themselves. But the second area is the one that Honor has talked about, is that this only works if this inspires action at the national level. And I can see that there's going to be a real incentive for that kind of action this year and for attention to be placed on it and for initiatives like Biofins. I'm a huge fan of the approach that the Paris Agreement took around nationally determined contributions. This stuff only works when you have national dialogues. But also you need to have clarity about what the real economy changes are going to be within those countries. And there's a great idea that I think the kind of coincidence of the COP26 and COP15 under the Convention of Biodiversity is a really good idea. So nature-based solutions are coming up under both of them. The UK government has kicked off something called the Food, Agriculture and Commodities Trade Dialogue, which is looking at establishing zero deforestation trade between producer and consumer countries around things like palm oil, timber. So something that's real economy like that, I think we'd really like to see those get pushed forward. And lastly, of course, the financial sector. You know, it's not up to us to just sit there with our arms folded and say, well, we can't do anything yet. And that's why the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures, such a great initiative. And I'm really hoping that we can take some of these ideas that we've been talking about today and place that within the context of increasing understanding financial risk, but also the financial opportunity that can come from nature positive investments. And this year is going to be crucial for that.
Yeah, a really, really important year. And let's hope it all gets through. So thank you both so much for joining us today to sort of share or bring some life to some of these recommendations and your own views for the year. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.